Hi, this is Jefferson Calico, your Comparative Religion instructor, and in the class we've got our second project coming up on sacred space. You're going to be doing a presentation on sacred space, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about that assignment and ways of looking at sacred space. So I think of sacred space, first of all, as an intensifier. So what sacred space does is it acts as an intensifier of a religious experience. So consider this like you can take a magnifying glass and take it out on an ordinary sunny day and hold it up to the sun, and what it will do is it takes the diffuse rays of sunlight and bends them, concentrates them, focuses them into one concentrated beam of sunlight, and you can actually start a fire on an ordinary sunny day with this magnifying glass by concentrating and focusing the diffuse light rays. So sacred space works in a similar way. It functions by focusing and concentrating the experience of the sacred in the minds of the worshipers. And by doing so, by focusing and concentrating that experience, it can start a fire, right? It can arouse a spiritual fervor of some sort. So the whole space, so a sacred space is like a magnifying glass. It signifies and magnifies the presence of the sacred and immerses the worshiper in this setting, context of sacred symbolism, directing, focusing the attention toward pushing the attention of the worshiper towards the sacred. So this magnifying or intensification function is accomplished in lots of different ways. It might be accomplished through art or pictures, images, which are representations of the divine. It could be the architecture itself of that sacred space. It confronts the viewer, the worshiper, with the symbols of this sacred reality, and enables the worshiper to focus on this reality. So in sacred space, it intensifies experience, focuses and compresses it, saturates the experience of the participant with the divine. So it's a space in which one becomes more intensely aware, more focused, more sensitive than in normal places and times. So once we see that sacred space acts as an intensifier of experience, then we can see this next step, which is that sacred spaces may engender or produce different types of intense experiences. So there may be differences in the emotional quality of the experience in certain sacred sites. So for instance, the ecstatic experience of a wild Sufi festival is going to be very different than sort of the quiet, meditative experience of monks praying in a monastery. Both would be examples of very intense experiences, magnified way beyond ordinary experience. But one would be loud, explosive, expressive, raucous even. And the other would be focused intensely inward, quiet, withdrawn, still. So sacred space can produce different types of emotional experiences with different emotional qualities. So if you want to think about this figuratively for a moment, there's the mountain and the womb. On the mountaintop, you are lifted up, high above ordinary concerns, far away from ordinary life. Your mind and your spirit are elevated towards great things. You dwell on great truths, and at the same time you're open, you're exposed, you're dangerous. The atmosphere on the mountaintop is thin. You're dangerously close to supernatural power. So it might be this triumphant experience, but also could be an uncomfortable experience. In the womb, however, the womb space, the experience, right, is very different. You go down. It's dark and warm. It's comforting. You're held and embraced. It's close and snug, and this type of it could be so it's welcoming and safe, comfortable, right? A place where you're so protected and safe that you can fall asleep. Or at the same time, right, it could be too close. It could be suffocating, claustrophobic, and sort of scary in that sense. So there are these two different sort of qualities. Is your sacred space that you're going to be looking at, is it a womb or a mountain? Or is it something else altogether? So look for the type of spiritual experience, emotional, mental experience that the site produces. So another thing that you may want to ask is, how did this particular place become sacred in the first place? And there's a number of ways that things become considered sacred by people. It could be because there's the belief that a supernatural event happened at this particular place. So this particular site marks some sort of supernatural occurrence. So for instance, in Jerusalem, there is a church built on the place where it is believed that Jesus was crucified, right? So what makes that church a sacred space? Because it's believed that this supernatural event, a historical supernatural event, occurred at this place. And another way is that it might be connected to part of a sacred story. So for instance, there are in Jewish history, there are a number of places that are considered sacred because they're connected to this Jewish history. So for instance, Masada is a site of Jewish martyrdom, this fortress where Jews were martyred during the Roman rebellion against Rome, and today it's considered almost shrine-like, almost sacred, because it's part of this. Or one of the concentration camps now, where that's considered almost like a shrine to Jewish martyrs, because it's part of this sacred story. Another might be just because it's this particular place is at the center of a community. So, for instance, in a lot of our little country towns in Kentucky, there was a church built. It may be off in the middle of nowhere now, but at one point, it was at the center of a little farming community. And so that place, if you were a part of this community, if you identified with this community and you lived there, then this was your sacred place. And the little church symbolized the spiritual aspect of this community. And that was the sacred space. Another might just simply be, sort of building on that, might just sort of be tradition and time. So, for instance, this place is sacred because I worship there, and my father worshiped there, and his father worshiped there, and for generations upon generations, our people have come here and worshipped or prayed or meditated or whatever it might be. So there's this pattern through time of considering this sacred and doing sacred things, worship and veneration in this site. So tradition and time. Another might simply be because of that it marks a significant geography or astronomical alignment. So these are especially important in indigenous or earth-based traditions, right, where a special geography, a particular mountain, or particular astronomical alignments, like at Stonehenge, right? It's sacred because perhaps astronomical alignments and other things. But the site marks this special geography and or astronomical alignments. Another reason might be just because this place is connected to a significant personal or communal experience. And so what I'm thinking about here may be something like the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's not, the place where it is really isn't, I mean, it's on the National Mall, and that's an important place, but its site isn't necessarily sacred in and of itself, but the importance of it is. The reason it's considered almost sacred, almost like a shrine by people, is because it it's connected to this communal memory of this significant experience of the Vietnam War, all the men and women who were lost during that, and that particularly tumultuous time in American history. So this becomes considered a sacred site because when you go to that site, then you're connected in this very visceral way to this significant experience that occurred. So this is some of the ways that a place may become sacred, and as you look at your specific sacred space, you might see that some of these things, or you might come up with some other reason that the site is considered sacred. Another marker of sacred space that you will want to look for is that sacred space is distinct, it's defined, it's set apart from normal or ordinary space. So there are boundaries that distinguish ordinary space from sacred space. And these boundary points, they mark places at which consciousness and awareness shifts from an ordinary consciousness to some sort of, we would call it an altered state or something like that, but an awareness of sacred things. Those might be physical markers of some sort, a wall, a gate. They could be ritual acts of some sort, especially if the space is temporary, right? So in a vision quest, you may go out and you're going to mark a circle, or you're going, and at each of the four cardinal directional points of the compass, you're going to say a prayer or invoke the spirits. And these ritual acts mark a boundary that separates this space from ordinary space. They could also be marked through rules of behavior, perhaps. So does the behavior of people change when entering a site? And how does that, right? Are there rules or customs or traditions, spoken or unspoken, that people follow that limit the types of acceptable behavior? So for instance, an example of this way of defining sacred space would be telling children not to run in church, right? Because running and playing, laughing, shouting, these are all normal childhood behaviors. So when rules like this are enforced, don't run in church. When they're enforced, they change and limit that ordinary behavior. Why? The answer is that this ordinary, playful behavior, well, it's fine in ordinary space, playground or whatever. It shows a lack of reverence for the sacred space, right? The behavior actually, in a sense, desecrates the sacred space by turning it into ordinary space. So look for these markers. Look for ways that your sacred space is defined, or the sacred space you're writing on or presenting on. How is it defined and bounded? What sets it apart from ordinary space? Okay, within the sacred space itself, you're going to be looking for these various markers of intensification, right? So you're going to be looking for art, architecture, the way the space is set up to produce a intense spiritual experience. Some of those things that we might want to look at, right? Is there a worship space set off, or sacred space set off from a socializing or public space, like a sanctuary on one hand, or in a fellowship hall on another? So is space divided in different ways? Look at things like doors. Are the doors tall and wide, or are they narrow? Are ceilings high and open, or are they low? Is the space dark? Is it well lit? Think about the difference between bright fluorescent lights and sort of a diffuse colored light filtering through high stained glass windows. And what does that do, right? What impression does this make on the viewer? High spaces tending to lift the mind toward, that's the mountain, right, towards a high transcendent deity, while low dark spaces elicit different sorts of emotional responses. You might also want to look for levels of sanctity. So we a little talked about that in terms of the worship space and a public space. But so are there places within the sacred space that are more sacred than others? And how are these places marked? Are they higher? Are they lower? Are there steps, right, leading up and down? So if you go to a Catholic church, what you may see is that the altar, that there's steps up to the altar. Why is that? What does that signify? Is there an activity that's remarkably central? So does the architecture of the site focus your attention on a particular central activity, like a pulpit or an altar? And those are very different things. Or are there peripheral spaces, right? Spaces off to the side that offer other spiritual options. So for instance, in a Hindu temple, or again, like a Catholic cathedral, there might be shrines, there may be a central worship site, but then shrines off to the side to different gods or different saints and different prayer spaces and things like that. So what is that all about? You also might want to look for barriers. Are there barriers that limit access to places, right? Walls, railings, steps, curtains, other things that might limit access to certain parts of the sacred space. You also might want to look for this idea of pilgrimage within a sacred space. So as you move through the sacred space, are you moving through a different set of experiences? From a less sacred space on this journey towards a more sacred space. So some spaces are set up to move you through them. Also, you might want to look for the way people are set apart in sacred space, right? Are there distinctions made between people by where they sit or where they stand? What they do, their role in the sacred space, or how they dress, and what does this mean, and how does this produce this sacred experience? So I hope that you'll find a sacred site that you're interested in, and you'll be creative in how you approach and do this assignment. As far as I'm concerned, your sacred site that you are going to present on could be a national cathedral, a very public and important large site, or it could be your own church. I'm really open to what the site is, but I want you to look at it and think about it see it with new eyes, and analyze it as a site that's set apart to produce certain spiritual responses, emotional and mental responses in people. So look at it through these new eyes, and I hope that maybe some of the things we talked about on this video might help you to look at that site and analyze it, and to talk about and discuss the type of spiritual experience for a worshiper that this site might elicit. So I hope you enjoy it, and looking forward to your projects.